Hello students, welcome to the second installment of your Objective 9 evolution notes. This one is over selection. Mr. Russell here at the Chateau de Russell, or Russelhausen if you prefer German. My partner in biology, Hermosa, is here. She's very upset because I won't play with her right now, but we have important things to talk about. So let's talk about it. All right, so we talked before about how we are looking at evolution through this thing we call VISTA, V-I-S-T-A, variation, inheritance, selection, time, and adaptation. Um, V for variation, I for inheritance, and now S for selection. We already talked about how you have to have variation within a species in order for it to be able to change, and you have to have inheritance because if an organism is successful, it's got to be able to pass those traits on to the next generation. So let's talk about how we decide, or I shouldn't say we or even decide, because there's no decision made about who's successful, but that's where the selection comes in. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about fitness. Okay, I'm sure you've heard the term fitness before. Usually refers to how physically fit you are. If you're, you hit the gym or you like to run every day and you're in good shape, they call that fitness. In biology, it's kind of similar, but a little bit different, and that is just an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. So if you are an organism that lives in the ocean, things that would increase your fitness, increase your ability to survive and reproduce might be gills or fins or something like that. Okay, if you live in the trees in a rainforest, then a long tail that helps you keep your balance while jumping from tree limb to tree limb might help your fitness. So the better you are, you being the organism here, are at surviving your environment and then being able to reproduce in that environment, the higher your fitness is. Okay, so anything that increases your fitness is something that increases your ability to survive and reproduce. So what selection is when certain organisms are chosen. I put that in quotes because nobody's doing the choosing, but certain organisms are able to survive and reproduce better than others, and those would be the organisms with a higher fitness. Okay, so that is selection. This idea that some organisms are going to be able to move on. They're going to be able to survive and reproduce in the environment. Okay, better traits are going to increase your fitness. So, like I said, if you're in the ocean, maybe gills. Those are going to be really helpful. So they're going to increase your fitness. Okay, and I mentioned those things. Wings, also a great adaptation. Definitely going to increase your fitness. You can get away from predators. You can hunt your own prey. You can migrate during certain times of the year if you need to. Definitely going to increase your fitness. All right, there's two types of selection we're going to talk about here, or main types, I should say. The first is natural selection, and then the second is artificial selection, and we will talk about both of those. Okay, natural selection is really, really important to this objective, this idea of evolution, of things changing over time. Natural selection is kind of the engine that drives evolution. Okay, evolution is this process that happens over time, but natural selection is what forces it to happen. It's what forces things to change. Okay, a very important point here that all organisms over-reproduce. Okay, it doesn't matter if we're talking about elephants or cockroaches or E. coli in your intestines or the grass in your front yard, all organisms over-reproduce, meaning they reproduce way more offspring than the environment can actually support. Okay? Another important point here is that the environment is a nasty, scary place. Okay? So, important thing to remember there too, that nature sucks. Not in our terms, because we love it. I love going outside and enjoying nature, but it is a bad place where there's not enough to eat, and there's not enough to drink, and there's not enough shelter, and there's always somebody trying to eat you, and then if you're trying to eat somebody else, they're trying to get away from you. So it is a nasty, scary place, and lots of organisms die. For most species, most of their offspring will die before they ever make it to adulthood to reproduce. And that's a really important idea, because since some offspring are going to die and some are going to survive and reproduce, it kind of begs the question, who is going to be able to survive and who is going to reproduce when the others around them are dying and not reproducing? And that is going to be the organisms with a higher fitness level, those with the best traits. They are going to be able to survive and reproduce when others can't. Okay? And as they do so, their traits, whether that be the wings or the gills or anything else, those traits are going to get passed on to their kids. And since they're having more kids, you're going to see those traits show up more often. Okay? You've heard the term survival of the fittest. That's exactly what this is, survival of the fittest. Fittest meaning those that are best suited to survive and reproduce, have the highest fitness, are going to survive and reproduce more often. Okay, and what this causes is over time a species changes, and you have an example right here. We have orange bugs and green bugs, and then we have a bunch of birds that are eating them. The birds say, yum, green beetles, our favorite. It's not really it's their favorite. The birds are probably just catching whatever they can, and as you can see, the birds have green beetles in their mouths. So maybe this is I don't know, an orange sandy background. So it's easier for the birds to see their prey if the prey is green. So with each generation, you have more and more of these green beetles disappearing. You'll notice there's fewer here than at the top, and then down at the bottom, they've all been picked off. We kind of talked about an example with moths doing the same thing. If the moths have better camouflage, they're going to be eaten less often, and they're going to be able to survive. And if they're surviving, then they're reproducing. So all right, we need to talk about 3 different kinds of natural selection that all affect populations in different ways. And when we talk about a population, we're just talking about a group of living things of the same species all living in the same place. So a herd of wildebeest or a school of salmon or something like that. Okay, the first kind is directional selection, as you can see up here. And this is when you have organisms at one end of a graph or one end of the spectrum for a certain trait. They are selected for, and so the whole population is going to change in the same way. So you can see a graph down here that shows you this. The dotted line is the original population. This is talking about beak size in birds. And this is made up data, by the way, too, because it changes over 20 years, and it almost never happens that quickly. Anyway, you'll see the average length of a beak is about 10 centimeters in 1985, and then just 20 years later, in 2005, the average length of a beak is, 13, 14 centimeters, something like that. So, for whatever reason, it was an advantage for these birds to have a longer beak. Maybe their food source changed and they had to start digging around in rocks looking for insects or something to eat. Okay, but that is directional selection, because if you look at a graph of this, the whole population moves to the right. It moves one direction. Ha, I said one direction. Anyway, so that's directional selection. And this is going to cause a whole population to change in the same way. So giraffes' necks getting longer, that's another great example of directional selection, because it was an advantage for giraffes to have a longer neck. Second kind of selection that we need to talk about is called stabilizing selection. And this is actually what happens most of the time. And this is what keeps populations similar over long periods of time, okay? And this is, instead of the organisms on one end of the spectrum being selected, organisms in the middle are selected. So you can see our dotted line shows the old population, and our solid line with the blue background here shows our newer population. So you'll see that our graph, this shape on here, this bell shape, got skinnier and taller. And that's because more of our population falls in this. So in this case, it's worse to be a freak, or it's worse to be out on the end of the spectrum. This is a cool example. This talks about birth weight in humans. Okay, the average birth weight for a baby is about 7 pounds. Okay, there are some babies born much smaller than that. We're not going to include premature births here. We're going to talk about normal full-term births. And some babies are still born down there in that 4-pound range. And you also have some 10-pound babies come out too. And for various reasons, it's not good to be too small or too big. Babies that are too small, that are down here on this end of the spectrum, they have trouble staying warm enough. That's just a physics issue. Larger organisms have an easier time maintaining their body temperature, so little babies have trouble staying warm, and they also are more prone to certain infections and things like that. And then babies that are too big, it's obvious why that would be a problem. If it's too big, it's not going to fit through the mother's pelvis, and that could injure or kill the baby and the mother on the way out. So over time, humans have gotten more and more average when it comes to their birth weight. Okay, and this, so like I said before, this gets rid of the extreme examples, so the tiny babies and the huge ones. This is going to get rid of those, and it's going to select for something in the middle, and it's going to keep a population kind of average and normal, at least for this certain trait. Okay, as I said before, this is what happens most commonly, because most mutations are actually not good. Most living things are pretty well evolved the way they are, so most things that come along are not actually going to help them. So stabilizing selection is going to help maintain that. This is what keeps certain organisms the same for really long periods of time. You may have heard before that sharks, when you find their fossils from 50 million years ago, they look pretty much the same that they do now. They were just a lot bigger for the most part. So that would suggest to us that sharks must be a design that really works, and it's worked throughout the ages because they have managed to survive without really changing too much. Ferns are another example. It's a type of plant, and it's a really, really old kind of plant. Paleontologists find like fossilized imprints of ferns, like they're pressed into mud from a long, long time ago, 100 million years ago. So ferns, just like sharks, have not changed over time, and it's stabilizing selection that keeps them that way. It keeps the population average. Our third type is the opposite of stabilizing selection. It's called disruptive selection. And you'll see here from our graph that we start out with the same normal bell curve, the dotted line, the original population. Here, it's actually worse to be average. It's better to be on one end of the spectrum or the other. Okay, so this talks about birds' beaks again. Maybe there's a change in this bird's food source, so whatever was here in the middle is no longer available. Maybe they were eating fruits or something like that. But there's some seeds available, and seeds are easier to eat if you have a short beak and you can crack the seeds open, almost like a nutcracker. There's also some insects crawling around in the rocks on the ground, so a long beak will allow you to get at them. But it doesn't really do you any good to be here in the middle. So here, this population is being disrupted. That's why they call it disruptive selection. And what happens over time is that these guys, their beaks are going to continue to get shorter. These guys' beaks are going to get longer, and this graph is going to stretch out horizontally more. And you're going to have fewer and fewer here in the middle. And what can happen eventually is what's called speciation, which is where these two groups, the short beaks and the long beaks, they get so different that they stop reproducing with one another. Maybe because they're hanging out in different places now looking for their food. But if they stop reproducing with one another, what you've created is two new species. So we'd have a short beak species and a long beak species. They'd still be pretty similar, but if they're not reproducing with one another, then they are two new species. And this happening over and over and over again over billions of years on Earth is how we get the huge variety of life that you find on planet Earth. Okay, the last thing we need to talk about is artificial selection. I'm sure you've heard the term artificial before. It means something that's man-made, like turf on our football field. That is made out of plastic instead of real grass, so that's why they call it artificial turf. Okay, in this case, we're not talking about what an advantage or what is an advantage in the wild. We're talking about humans actually controlling these populations and deciding what traits should be passed on. So instead of survival and reproduction being the criteria here, it's people keeping these, in this case, dogs as pets and deciding what they want. Oh, I want something that has a really long spine and ridiculously short legs. And what you ended up with over time, thousands of years, was a dachshund. Or I want something that's pretty big and lean and with a real territorial personality. So that's how we get Doberman Pinschers. Okay, At some point, wild wolves started spending a little more time around humans, probably eating our scraps, and they decided through natural variations that we weren't so bad. I'm sure it wasn't all wolves, just some of them. And then humans deciding that the wolves, as long as they weren't trying to hurt us, as long as they're eating our scraps, they may actually be helpful too. So at some point, the wolves basically, not thinking about it because they're wolves, not people, but they basically gave up their freedom in order to have a steady meal, meaning our scraps, and also not to have to fight with us over food like they may have been doing before. The wolves started to basically live among humans, and humans decided what traits they wanted. They started picking the friendlier wolves and looking for traits that they wanted. And that happening over lots and lots of years, people deciding they wanted different things, you end up with all of these different breeds of dogs. Okay? So, it's not nature killing off the undesirables. In this case, it is humans deciding which organisms will get to reproduce, and that means their traits get passed on. So maybe it's the dog's size, or maybe it's its color, or maybe it's its temperament, or its temperament, yeah, its personality, or maybe it's hunting instincts. Will it chase after wild game and chase them out of their cover so that you can go hunt them? Okay, all domesticated animals, dogs, cats, livestock, sheep, pigs, cows, all of these things have been selectively bred by humans so that we get what we want out of them. If we're talking about livestock, it usually means we want them to be healthy, and we want them to be cooperative, and we want them to produce a lot of meat. Really interesting example, I don't have a picture of it on here, but a cow called a Belgian Blue, and they are enormous. They're almost as tall as people are, if not taller, and they have just tons and tons of muscle. It looks like they're on steroids or something like that. But they have actually just been selectively bred that way with more muscular cows all the time. And now what you get is these enormous cows which produce tons and tons of meat. Okay? Same thing goes for food crops, corn, strawberries, broccoli. All of these things come from wild plants, and people have controlled which plants got to reproduce with which ones so that we got the traits we wanted. And in the process, we end up with all of the vegetables and fruits that you see in a grocery store. Okay, so that is selection. Remember that it all depends on fitness, how able you are to survive and reproduce in the wild. There's two kinds. Natural selection is where nature chooses, and I won't go back over each of the three kinds, but those are important as well too. Nature doesn't really choose, but nature is mean and kills off many, many organisms, so the only ones that survive are going to be the ones that have the best traits, the highest fitness. Artificial selection, instead of the organisms with low fitness dying off, it's humans actually choosing what traits we want passed on. All right, thanks. Hope you enjoyed. Happy Friday tomorrow.